would like to invite the Prime Minister to defend the case that stands in his name. Please welcome him.
Test. Can everyone hear me? Yes.
MIDP.
After the bombing of the plane in Sharm el-Sheikh and the continuous civil war that's still happening in Syria, Turkey, and Iraq, we have concluded that ISIS are not just a rag-bang groups of extremists. They are individuals who have ideological hold over a whole region and are recruiting more and more individuals day by day. That's why we don't think a directly hostile approach by just keeping sending troops to assist people can be the sustaining policy anymore. We have to negotiate also within their own particular terms. And in this particular debate, it's also about buying out the slaves who don't get as much visibility as they should in the media. Because we think all these operations that have happened so far by the Western Russian countries are at the expense of these invisible slaves. Let's make them clearer to the world, the eyes of the world. In my speech, I'll talk about 4 major issues. Firstly, how exactly will we conduct this policy? Secondly, why exactly does it work principally and pragmatically? Thirdly, why would ISIS comply to these particular negotiations? But lastly, I'm also going to talk about, does this actually strengthen ISIS? We would say no, it actually aids in their downfall. Before I move on to my arguments, a few characterizations as to firstly, how will this work? When we talk about buying out slaves, firstly, this funding will be collective based upon all capable countries in the world. It's not going to be specifically Western or specifically Eastern, especially now because we can see that even Russia and China are also in the war against ISIS, like even at the expense of their allegiances to countries like Iran, which means they care a lot about this front, right? But secondly, even though we are okay with all these Americans funding these particular efforts, we want to make sure that the point men, the middlemen that negotiate with this particular ISIS slave masters are people in Iraq, are people who are much more relatable to these individuals and are able to carry out these negotiations and not just random Western individuals, Russian individuals trying to buy out those particular slaves, right? But thirdly, we would also ensure that we don't just buy out these slaves and leave them alone. We will also give them a safe haven and security in order for them to exit their particular destitute and servitude at the end of the day. Right? We think the major purpose in which we do this is because firstly, we don't think rescue operations always works. Because what happens when it comes to slaves is that unlike saving an entire villages, these people are kept locked up. It's hard for you to identify them out in the open when it comes to societies. And these people are the ones that usually suffer the most, right? The fact that they're used as human shields because even their ISIS caliphates consider them as less human. So we want to decrease the collateral damage that exists from rescue operations. But if we can see that intelligence does exist and rescue operations are possible, we will still carry them on, but we want buying out slaves to be an option. Secondly, why would this work? Firstly, on a principle basis, we think the reason this would work is because it's the only thing that's ideologically friendly towards this particular caliphates that exists under their side, because they engage in slave trading anyway. So we also have to concede that even if we do not buy out these particular slaves, these ISIS people would still have slaves and still profit from their slaves because those trades still happen within those particular regions. That's why we want the Western nations to also free them, because at least the Western nations or Russia are better at doing that and providing them a safe haven and a better living standard as opposed to an exchange between slave masters, right? But secondly, because they would say, well, this is principally bad because then it will create an international precedent that buying out people is legitimate. Firstly, slavery is something that's already against the Geneva Convention. So we don't think all nations will suddenly jump on the bandwagon and be like, hey, you know what, buying out slaves is all right. We think this is very context specific and it's expensive where these people are pushed to a corner and cannot resort to any other policies. That's why they have to buy out these particular slaves, because at least we give them hope to come out of their servitude at the end of the day. But secondly, even if let's say it is principally bad, we think that it is at least better because we remove these people from their servitude and give them a sense of hope and life as opposed to the type of torture in which they face right now, where a lot of these slaves commit suicide, a lot of these slaves feel as if they have no rights whatsoever, even in the future, right? But secondly, why is this necessarily pragmatic, right? Sit down. The reason why we think this is really pragmatic is because firstly, we feel the reason why it's pragmatic is The fact of the matter is, we actually allow these people to come out of that particular servitude because when you negotiate with these slave masters, obviously the type of slaves that will be displayed, right? So these are the people that I have, these are the people that you would like to buy, these are the people that you are able to identify at the end of the day. This is different from rescue operations, which when you come into those villages and you don't see these particular individuals, and these people will hide those particular slaves in basements or in all of these people so that they aren't able to see, so that they aren't visible at the end of the day. So when we bring these people out, what we do is firstly, we make rescue operations cleaner, if not perfect, right? Because there'll be less collateral damage from these particular incidents in which these people are kept hidden at the end of the day, in which we at least bring these people out first before we do more bombings, before we do all of these things that happen at the end, right? But thirdly, also, we want to also engage on this idea. This doesn't necessarily strengthen ISIS because we're giving them money, right? But firstly, I don't think that ISIS needs slavery in order to make money. The fact that it's based upon economic oil fields and all of the trades of smuggling of drugs, in which they already do, we think we can already exclusively attack those minefields, attack their other economy bases, while still buying out these slaves who need those particular freedoms at the end of the day, right? Because like it or not, even if we don't do this, the ISIS people will still have money, but at least now we give that form of recourse to these individuals at the end of the day, these slaves, right? Before I move on, yes, opening.
In the theater of war, you will not be able to save everyone. But if your tax dollars are putting the next bullet in the gun of an ISIS operatives, killing your soldiers and harming your warfare against them, how are you winning the battle against ISIS then?
No, because firstly, we think the other contradiction of why it doesn't make ISIS stronger is because we feel that right now when the coalition between nations are stronger, they are still significantly stronger than all these ISIS members at the end of the day because there are the coalitions of powers that happens between nations, right? But at least what happens now is that when we rescue these operations, it won't be reckless, it will be much more targeted and will save less lives, right? Because I don't think they can just get away, but in theater of war, you can't save everyone. And our side, at least we save more lives at the end of the day. But lastly, it's also about the sense of hope in which we give these particular individuals, right? Because right now, a lot of these slaves commit suicide because things like rescue operations do not give as much of a guarantee because of the fact that rescue operations can fail. So in the end of the day, these people sometimes internalize their servitude and would never want to leave that particular area at the end of the day, right? Because of this, we think it's better for us to buy out those particular slaves and slowly, gradually transition them out of that particular servitude so that they don't go through the emotional trauma that's involved in when it comes to runaway slaves or having to run away from their particular persecution at the end of the day, right? But secondly, it's also because of this ideal that the fact is these individuals will have hope, even if these individuals still have hope, because they want to hold on to their hopes even to the end of their lives, we make that hope realistic. As opposed to continuously torture them under this chamber because there's a high likelihood that ISIS will accept your payment for manumission and freeing of slaves as opposed to attacking their basements in order to save these particular people. I think all of these things are strategic calls we need to make in order to ensure that less collateral damage happens, in order to better our rescue operations. Even if it marginally increases the strength of ISIS, we can still fight them without hurting innocent slaves. I am proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Hazim, for that impassioned beginning of the debate. We'd now like to invite the Leader of Opposition to begin the case for side opposition. Here.
Can anyone see me? Ladies and gentlemen, this is a debate about priorities in an already horrible situation. This is a war, a multi-issue war that's more than just an issue about slavery. It's an issue about oppression and the power of ISIS in that region. In on-site opening opposition, we believe that this debate is about hard decisions. This debate, we have sacrificed soldiers, abandoned military positions and resources because it has cost us more to defend it. There is no ideal in a war. War are all about hard decisions and how we save more lives at the end of the day. On side opening opposition, we do believe that slavery is horrible and the most morally reprehensible action. and anyone engaging in it, whether it is creating, selling, purchasing, or being complicit in either the legitimization of slavery or empowering the body that tries to that conducts slavery, we believe that's morally reprehensible as well. We think that ISIS has categorized non-Muslims, women, and Sunni who don't believe in their cause as lesser being. And we believe that capable countries should play no part in funding an oppressive economic structure. So we will tell you three things. Firstly, what our position is on dealing with ISIS slaves. Secondly, how this empowers ISIS economy. And thirdly, how this encourages them to capture more slaves. No, thank you. Firstly, we tell you that I have right now, and let's categorize status quo for you. Having slaves are not necessarily beneficial to ISIS's economy right now. This is because of the unique situation that we have created after the progress that we have had after several interventions. Because having to feed the slaves costs a lot of money. And the fact that ISIS has lost a lot of their main cities and lost a lot of their oil refinery means they have very, very little use and incentive to have slaves right now. They have been reducing the amount of slaves due to the fact that we have been weakening them over a long period of time. We think that slaves also cost attention and money and they need supervision. That's why ISIS needs station guards and can't leave the slaves around family members because they are worried that the slaves will retaliate. So in fact, having slaves has been non-profitable for ISIS for a while. So the reason they take in slaves, however, is part of their psychological warfare to dehumanize people and manipulate the West in order to be able to have the West play their game. That means that if we leave this alone and continue to weaken ISIS, that is the way in which we're able to deal with both ISIS and the slave trade in totality. This is an exclusive and unique situation right now because on December 2014, US airstrikes have destroyed a majority of oil refineries in Syria and Iraq that are controlled by ISIS, limiting their oil revenue, making them significantly weaker and significantly economically weaker right now. That means that we are in the best position to deal with ISIS given their current economic situation. We also have several countries intervening like Russia, United States, UK, and so on, will despite their political affiliations still committed towards targeting ISIS. We've also seen a huge decrease in recruitment of ISIS, who have reduced 60% over the year 2014 to 2015. That has been because of all our border control efforts and all of those other things. That means that right now, most of our targeted efforts have been useful in making ISIS significantly weaker. So what we think would happen is this is a particular policy that can be used to continuously extort capable companies, and ISIS would be able to gain their economic advantage they had at the start and continue to be a superpower in the region. No, thank you. Firstly, we tell you that the money that you are paying are directly being used for the oppression and the killing of your soldiers, as well as the killing of and oppression of people in Syria, Iraq, and in further other peoples in the region. We think that that money will be directly used to kill all those people. This has several impacts on this debate. Firstly, we think that paying more to ISIS empowers their capability to further oppress individuals in that region. It also gives them significant military strength. Like for example, right now, ISIS is weakened militarily because of their lack of ammunition as well as their lack of weapons, due to the fact that the weapons that they collected from the United States military that they left in Iraq have been used up, and most of them have been left behind. So right now, ISIS don't have much weapons, and by giving them this economic advantage, you're putting weapons on their hand and enabling them to fight against intervention as well as to fight against villagers who are currently defenseless. So we think you only empower ISIS more, who can currently easily invade villages and fight against the military with more ammunition. You only harm people a lot more. Before that, closing.
ISIS will continuously have money and direct their funds to put their bullets in the guns anyway. But if your primary focus is always to remain antagonistic and engage them in direct combat, won't the oppression and won't the killing of your own soldiers prolong?
Firstly, we don't think just by trading off the slave, suddenly you'll change the way in which ISIS rhetorics operate. because you don't change the way in which they think or their political narrative in any sense. But secondly, this is a debate about spectrums. Obviously, ISIS will always aim to get more money, but right now they do not have more money, and we are in the best position to weaken them economically. And by weakening them economically, we can reduce their rhetoric and their strength and prowess within those areas. We also think that by doing this, you increase ISIS rhetoric and their ability to be seen as a more powerful entity. Realize that ISIS use their money not only for military capability, but also to buy people in order to join ISIS. So you strengthen their rhetoric, pay away poor people who then will join ISIS because of the increased power that ISIS and the increased money that ISIS now have. We think you only strengthen ISIS' ability to spread their rhetoric. And lastly, we think, and most significantly, you encourage them to take more slaves, because also realize that capturing more cities and capturing more oil refineries is tough, but invading a village and getting more slaves is not as tough. So that means that for them to be able to invade an oil refinery that's heavily guarded, it's so much harder and more economically unbeneficial for ISIS. So right now, the best thing for them to do is invade more villages, get as many slaves as they can, and then trade those slaves from capable companies who are now obligated to pay them a lot more for that slaves. We think this is great for ISIS on two levels, because not only did they now found a better way to earn money and fund their campaign, they also can weaken the economic prowess of other countries who are intervening in the cause for ISIS. So most of their money are now redirected towards paying off the slaves, and they have less money to combat and actually fight ISIS. We're incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. And now to continue the case beside opening government, we'd like to invite Hazim.
Something that's Is that better? Everyone hear me fine? Okay. The key thing that's missing from the analysis of the opening opposition is the ideological drive of ISIS. ISIS doesn't take slaves because they want the money. ISIS takes slaves because they are ideologically driven, because they think it is their right, because they think, according to their warped beliefs of the Quran and Sunnah, that they can oppress minorities and take these slave girls in. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time characterizing what exactly they do to these slave girls. Secondly, in my speech, I'm going to talk about why they will continue to therefore take slaves regardless, and why ISIS will want to accept our offer. And finally, the benefits we get when we're able to change the media narrative that exists against ISIS when nothing else seems to be changing the drive for people to actually join. So first, what actually happens to these slave girls? These are slaves that are taken in and raped. They are abused by multiple men on multiple nights, regardless of age. Girls as young as 13 and 14. So it's all fine and dandy for Jasmine to come here and talk about hard decisions that have to be made when she's not comparing the actual damage that occurs on thousands of innocent young girls caught in the crossfire for some speculative benefit that we might one day be able to contain ISIS, given the success that we've clearly already had, given that ISIS is being driven back from, I don't know, Libya, Egypt, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria, and all the countries that they spread to. Clearly your success is not happening, and we need to deal with the consequences of allowing these abuses to continue, so that trivial response does not compare in this debate. But let's talk about, no thank you. Let's talk about necessarily what happens to these girls. They're abused, they're raped, their families are threatened to be killed in front of them, and often are if they do not comply. Those things leave lasting damage. So even if one day you can tell me that you defeated ISIS, at what cost did you necessarily do that? That's something you have to engage with in the debate. Let's talk about what the state of ISIS now actually is. They say slaves now are not economically useful because they must be fed and they must be guarded and they cost money.
There are several reasons why they take slaves regardless, and we tell you that the amount of slaves that they take in the status quo and the amount of slaves that they take in our model are exactly the same. One, it is factually incorrect that they are losing money. The few oil fields that you have managed to bomb are still pumping oil. The oil fields in Syria that the coalition does not have permission to bomb are still pumping money. Extremists in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere are still pumping money and funding them. Rich sheikhs from Qatar are still pumping money in to ISIS. ISIS is still stealing from Iraqi military bases because they are overwhelmed and undertrained and cannot combat against the ISIS troops that are far superior to them on the battlefield and continue to make gains militarily. So they have the weapons, they have the money. That's not why they take the slaves. It is an ideological drive. And they tell us, well, look, border control has resisted the ability of them to actually be able to increase their recruitment. We think we can also have border control. We think we can also have rescue missions to rescue the slaves. The problem is that those things are not enough and the abuses continue to happen on a day-to-day basis. They say we encourage them to take over more villages in the process. No, thank you. We tell you that ISIS does not go to a village and say, but that's a lot of effort, that village over there. I don't think we should take that. ISIS runs roughshod over anything it takes because its entire selling point is that they have a khilafah, that they have a land to call their own. And the more land they have, the more people under their control, the more minorities they can abuse and claim as their own, the more legitimacy they gain in the eyes of their followers. That does not change under either side. What does change is the amount of slaves we can guarantee that we are able to actually save in the process. All the other war efforts that you engage in, we engage in them too, only now we save slaves in the process. That's something that they need to engage with on their side. The other reason why ISIS also takes slaves regardless of which, on both sides, is the promise that ISIS has made to its soldiers and those who come from afar to recruit in ISIS. What's the draw? Not only the khilafah, but wives. To be able to have your own slave girls, multiples of them. You can have sex anytime you want, guys, not just here on earth, but also in the afterlife as well. That's what they tell their followers to get them to join. At the point when they are not able to provide those slave girls, that's when the harm necessarily happens. But we think they are willing to make a trade-off on our side because they get money out of it. What else are they able to get out of it? Let's examine what the trade-off necessarily is. So they're able to get a little bit of money. Yes, we can see those money might go to bullets, but we think they would have bought those bullets anyways under your side. But they're able to say, oh, look, we're humiliating the West because they're now buying slaves from us. We'll take that humiliation if it means that we're able to save slaves in the process, the thousands of them that are taken by them. We also think that they want to be able to say oh, look, we took Western money. Again, these things do not hurt us, and if they do, very marginally. We think the larger benefit is the thousands of people that we save in the process. Let's talk about what the media narrative now turns to in the process now. Under our model, let's look at what the status quo is about changing the tide against ISIS. In the status quo, nothing has worked to change the people's minds. ISIS has been derided and has been debunked by every Muslim scholar you can possibly imagine, and people still join in mass. The one thing that has proven to be successful, the stories of their abused slaves. That is something that only our side is able to provide. I'll take you in a second. Only on our side are we able to say, we provide these stories for the masses. Because the prohibition, the multiple reasons that people join ISIS are for protection against Shias, because of religious beliefs, because of the fact that they mistrust the Shia government in Iraq. These are complicated reasons that are very difficult to ascertain, but we are able to counteract that ideology through the stories of the slaves. I'll take closing.
Is ISIS ideological stronghold on society naturally constructed or financially constructed?
Their ideological stranglehold on the area is neither financial or any other thing other than their ability to sell all these other factors that I talked about and be able to say, look, religion wants you to do this. Here's why you can abuse people. Let's talk about what the effect, therefore, is going to be. We're the only side that provides that counter-narrative when people are able to see that slaves are abused. There are multiple ISIS members who have left ISIS and went back to their governments in their home countries, in the UK, in the United States, and Canada, and said, I regret joining because I saw what they did there. At the moment when we're able to make that public to the extent that it is not already, we are able to at least gradually shift the tide of people joining. We're not saying that on our side we're going to definitely kill ISIS, although we think we can do everything that you can do on your side.
but at least we are able to change the media narrative when willing slaves who were once enslaved by them are able to come forth and tell their impassioned stories about the abuses that they say in the name of your religion, in the name of what you believe to be true about the afterlife. This is when Muslims who necessarily join ISIS no longer want to join and are able to provide a counter model. Look, the West is necessarily like, oh, they're so bad they killed Palestinians in Israel. Oh look, but now they're also helping the people in slavery. This is what we do to change the ideological tide. Nothing else is working. It's high time we save the thousands that are abusing the status quo and in the process turn the tide against ISIS.
Thank you very much. And now to conclude the opening exchange, I'd like to invite Mifsal.
Ladies and gentlemen, the opening opposition agrees. The fight against ISIS is an ideological one. However, ideologies are strengthened at the point at which somebody is willing to engage with you on the same level. That is why things like slavery require you to legitimize it by being complicit in it. It requires you to be complicit in it because then it allows ISIS to say that it was legitimate for me to do it because other people were willing to do it as well. At the point at which the bastion of democracy and intervention in the Middle East is now complicit in funding as well as encouraging slavery, ladies and gentlemen, I think that's a pretty good darn rhetoric to say that slavery is okay, not to the rest of the world, because I'm sure everyone in this room is pretty reasonable, but definitely, ladies and gentlemen, to encourage more individuals who are sympathetic towards ISIS to now be even more so with their cause at that side of the house. That was why Hazem needed to have less bluster and more engagement with Jasmine's speech in this debate. In my speech, I'll deal with the real politic in regards to what slavery can do, because he's right, it blows up on the media, and I'll tell you exactly why the international forces funding slavery, ladies and gentlemen, makes you less able to have political cooperation with the governments within Iraq, where it's absolutely necessary for you to have the cooperation of governments like Haider al-Abidi, or even, ladies and gentlemen, at worst, you might have countries like United States of America pulling out of the Middle East in totality because the politics of slavery, ladies and gentlemen, dictates that they pull out and they are outraged at the fact that the government is funding slavery. Firstly, is in regards to the funding. I want to engage with one thing first, two things. Firstly, is in regards to funding. The opening government cannot run on dated facts from early 2014 and think that they win this debate. The fact there are many things that have happened just this year alone. The fact that we've destroyed 80% of their oil refineries means that surely there's less money for them to be able to fund their ability right now. The fact that the world is uniform in blocking people from flying to Iraq and Syria for the purposes of joining ISIS surely means that recruitment is lesser under our side of the house. The fact that the acts of beheadings of journalists, ladies and gentlemen, as well as ISIS killing their own people, have scared off people in droves. The fact that there are so many defectors of ISIS under status quo means there are a myriad of reasons why ISIS is weakening to a significant extent in the current situation, ladies and gentlemen. That's why even the CIA reports tell you that 60% of recruitment has reduced from 2014 to 2015 because that's how much ISIS has lost popularity in the meantime. But under your side, ladies and gentlemen, you let them play the rhetoric that they have been playing all the while. Either number one, what Jasmine told you, ladies and gentlemen, that you're able to use that money to provide welfare. And this is something that we talked about earlier on, that you provide welfare for people who are poor and say, join our party. And these are the significant portions of people in Iraq and Syria that they are being recruited under that side of us. So you have to justify why your tax dollars is not only putting a bullet, but also adding another person in the ISIS ranks on that side of the house. But secondly, the recruitment rhetoric of saying that you are now strong, you are making the United States bend to your will, ladies and gentlemen, is the exact sort of rhetoric that makes ISIS look very appealing because it makes them look like they can succeed in their cause. Ladies, at the point at which you don't engage them in the act of slavery, you are a lot more likely to delegitimize them under that side of the house. Sure, they run roughshod now, but Hazem needs to deal with the word called more. Yes, they buy bullets anyway, but the point of the opposition is to prove that you can buy more bullets on that side of the house. And that means more people get killed, and that's why there is more harm. That's what you have to deal with on the opposition. So, I'm going to go on to my substantive material because we think it's exceptionally important. No, sit down. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to prove to you you're going to lose political support in Iraq. And Iraq is where it's fundamentally important for you to gain the support of the government of Iraq, because that's where you have the stronghold of the fight against ISIS. Firstly, you have the Kurdish Peshmerga forces, and you have the Iraqi government cooperating with the West, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to fight ISIS under that side of the house. However, Haider al-Abidi has a fractured as well as a divided government of Sunnis and Shiites under that side of the house. He's trying to pull together people who not only disagree with the fundamental ideology of cooperating with each other, but secondly, fundamentally disagree with cooperating with the West. At the point at which you say that the West is funding, number one, slavery, something that's morally abhorrent, but secondly, what will the Shiites in Iraq think at the point at which you're funding the slavery of Shiites in Iraq and Syria, ladies and gentlemen? It is more likely that Haider al-Abidi, the moderate in Iraq, will be unable to sustain political coalition, and you are more likely to have people pulling away support from the West and foreign intervention, because now you think that those people are the devil supporting the oppression of your brothers and sisters within the region and actually paying for it. At that point at which you lose the war within Iraq because you don't have the cooperation of the local forces there. They need to deal with that real political situation on that side. I'll take you, sir.
How do you delegitimize ISIS ideology by being stubborn with your own ideology? How is that more effective than taking the personal stories of these slaves, in which even Iraqi governments can empathize with?
We're not being stubborn at the point at which we're willing to save them, at the point where we don't have to pay them and do it by force and don't have to save anyone, and we're still fighting them, which means that we're not legitimizing them. But I like that the fact that he brought up the media narratives and what victims say. Because we like to analyze America now that we've told you that Iraq will be significantly jeopardizing their political support. America is having the election come up in 2016, ladies and gentlemen, and many Western states currently have very tenuous or very apprehensive positions when it comes to intervening in the Middle East. At the point at which, ladies and gentlemen, Democrats and Republicans are forced by the media with the issue, are you putting money in the hands of ISIS? At the point at which people like Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Ben Carson, ladies and Donald Trump is asked, are you putting more bullets in the hands of ISIS, killing our own troops? And put this in perspective, that these are countries that are war lethargic, just came back from the war of Iraq and Afghanistan, and are very apprehensive about losing their own forces already. You already have less political support from the American electorate as well as many Western forces, ladies and gentlemen, because you're telling them the very strong rhetoric and very easily spun rhetoric. So one victim says, I was a slave, but Fox News spins it as this slavery was continued by the United States of America under that side of the house. You lose American support within the area, and you fundamentally lose the war for a token measure on the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vipsal. That concludes the opening house exchange. Now moving on to the closing house, we'd like to invite the member of government.
Yes. Cool.
Ladies and gentlemen,
gentlemen, in the theater of war, there is no black and white decision. There is no absolute position that you can take. We would argue from closing government that just because you reroute some fund to help individuals that are in need does not mean that it absolves your responsibility to facilitate, help, and engage in other methods, ladies and gentlemen. Because the argument from opening opposition is that at the point in which you are facilitating this process of buying out these individuals, you lose the rhetoric and therefore you are pegged as the devil. We think that countries can often collectivize and ensure that some degree of separation and categorization of funds can exist, which means that, for example, countries like Russia and China can still help in the military engagement in those areas in the Middle East, whereas the United States can then position themselves and help in slavery and vice versa, which means that you can ensure some degree of effort that is dispersed consistently throughout, ladies and gentlemen. But what we will argue in this debate is two things. The first of which is we would not sacrifice individuals, specifically the Yazidi women and the Christian women that are utilized as a skewed form of spiritual fulfillment as a rhetoric that ISIS plays. Number two, I'm going to be talking about why capable countries as well as their citizens owe a duty to facilitate, help, and pass on and engage within these countries. But before that, several points of responses to opening opposition. Firstly, on this idea that taxpayers' money directly means that you are accountable and implicit in that position of slavery. Firstly, we will argue and head on and say that money will always exist in this particular regard. This debate is an evaluation on not just about how you use your money, but what's the value of the money that you're utilizing to ensure a comprehensive method of help, ladies and gentlemen. We will argue that at the point in status quo, there is a more popular rhetoric that is being utilized by ISIS right now. And it's not just money, right? That there is an incentive to tell individuals, especially the men in ISIS, that at the point in which you are able to get these slaves, convert them, they are the conduits to your spiritual journey to heaven, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, they told you that we are in a good position right now and ISIS can't get that economic advantage. The first thing we will have to understand in this debate is that ISIS isn't like any other military or combatant movements in status quo. They don't wave the white flag at the point in which they see a battalion charging against them and wanting to take them down. The position that ISIS always takes is that I would like to fight to the death to ensure that my jihadism continues, even though that jihadism is skewed, ladies and gentlemen. Right now, we would argue that you can engage in both fronts to ensure that we can best minimize the harm that is directed to individuals. Because the priority can't just be about the soldiers of a particular host countries. It also has to be about the individuals that you don't see being talked about in the media, that you don't see are being harmed, ladies and gentlemen. We need to put a human faces to those individuals. No, thank you. Lastly, on the idea of complicity, right? Because they say that you are tacitly condoning slavery. Number one, we will argue in closing government that at the point in which you pay and buy out these individuals, that you are taking a position to say that slavery is illegitimate, and at this point, we need to ensure that they can receive some degree of protection from things like rape, from things like being beaten up by these individuals. No, thank you. We think that complicity is a lot worse under that side of the house at the point in which they choose to take a position of not caring or being strategically ambiguous to ensure that your political legitimacy is more protected than people that are harmed. Lastly, we agree that there is a significant weakening that exists. No, thank you. But the point of the matter is, the ISIS is not dead. Palmyra was taken like just a few weeks ago, ladies and gentlemen, to ensure that they have an ability to exert some degree of force. The reason why they were able to take down Palmyra is because they were able to galvanize support from followers by way of saying that there is a skewed spiritual fulfillment that you can get from our policy. I'm going to talk about that now. No, thank you. So firstly, what happens when ISIS raids and pillage villages, ladies and gentlemen? The modus operandi that ISIS often operates on is that they come in at the wee hours in the morning, segregate these individuals based on their gender, and then shoot the entirety of the male population and take the women. But the most perverse part about this debate is that they don't just take any women, but they capitalize on capturing villages that have a large number of Yazidi women as well as Christian women, ladies and gentlemen. Why? Opening opposition said there is little need for slaves in the ISIS movement. We disagree, and this is not true. This is one of their primary policies that is utilized by ISIS right now. What is that? There is a skewed illusion of spiritual fulfillment sit-down myth, which means that women, specifically Yazidis and Christians, are perceived to be the conduits to heaven for ISIS fighters, ladies and gentlemen. How so? They are able to utilize the rhetoric that at the point in which you buy off these women, keep them and marry them, that you get the power from being able to convert them into Islam, because apparently converting a heathen brings a lot more benefit in the hereafter. Secondly, the rhetoric that you're able to capitalize on how much women as an ISIS fighter can I save in this tumultuous position that you have in status quo? No, thank you. Oftentimes, women are utilized as the argument that as an ISIS fighter, taking in these women, converting them, raping them, doing whatever you want with them, means that you have an automatic spot in heaven. We think what this policy does is it breaks that rhetoric. No, thank you. Right now, ISIS fighters don't just care about the money that they have, but as well as the religious fulfillment in terms of how much can I do in order to ensure that heaven is on my side. So it extends beyond just things like jihadism, ladies and gentlemen, but what I can do with these women. What we do on the outside of the house is we break this rhetoric and say, these women are not yours. Just because they are from a different religion does not mean you own them, does not give you the credence and the legitimacy for you to take them and convert and claim that this is your ticket to heaven. I'll take Jasmine.
So if ISIS kidnap and take slave for purely ideological reasons, then why would they take your money and sell their slaves to you?
Okay, here's a comparison, right? At the point at which they take that money and give it to you, the comparative difference is right now you say that they're currently weakening and want that money. We think that transfer can exist, but at this particular juncture, how do we best minimize the harm on both fronts? We think closing government does that. Secondly, let's talk about capable citizens, countries and their citizens. The thing about the fight against ISIS is that there is an invisible group of people that we don't want to care about or don't seem to know about. The way in which we perceive war is based on things like graphs, chart statistics, or if it's a visceral information that is presented to us, it is often about our citizens and our citizens alone. We think that capable countries not only have sufficient military force, but have the ability to maintain a position of power within that discussion. So what is more likely to contribute to the war fatigue that they were talking about is at the point in which my citizens and my citizens alone are harmed, this causes countries to want to pull out help. This happened in the 70s during the war in Somalia and South Sudan, where the United States citizens saw their soldiers being dragged at the back of the van, ladies and gentlemen. We think we owe a duty to protect these people as well, because we think at the point in which you are able to show that not only just your soldiers, but there are other human costs in this war as well. We need to expand the lens in the way in which people view the fight against ISIS and need to extend that phase of humanization as well, ladies and gentlemen. We need more people to be involved, and it's a point of relation. As opposed to my son's dying, now they'll think about this could potentially be someone who is just like my daughter or my friend who is being harmed. It is a regrettable position, but a position we must take in this debate. I'm supremely proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Jaina, for that heated speech. And now, to continue for side closing opposition, we'd like to invite from IIUM, Syed Sadiq.
General Petraeus of the US Navy says that ISIS is not similar to Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. Instead, they're more similar to the La Familia drug cartel in Mexico. ISIS' objective is to buttress and create an Islamic state, a state in which they can construct their ideological stronghold by putting welfare, healthcare, and jobs to ensure that individuals on the ground will continue to support them in the long run. And that's exactly what side government will do. One short rebuttal before I move on to my three extensions. They told us that now these slaves will be used as conduits to enter heaven. Notice how this is a contingent point. If I'm able to show that their policy significantly empowers ISIS, ladies and gentlemen, then the ability of ISIS to capture more slaves will be reduced quite significantly. Three extensions in my speech. Firstly, why slave money is uniquely different than other alternative financiers which side government has outlined. Secondly, how their policy facilitates the ideological stronghold which ISIS has, and finally, why their policy incentivizes sectarian violence and paranoia even in non-ISIS strongholds. And I think this is something which is pertinent because it impacts everyone, even if ISIS doesn't have a foothold there. No, rebuttals will be integrated. Question number one, slave money. They told us that they have alternative financiers like oil fields. Two responses there. Number one, even if you capture these oil fields, it's often ridiculously difficult to sell this oil to gain profit. Often you must sell it in the black market. This means, ladies and gentlemen, that even if you're able to reap profit, that profit is remarkably small to begin with. Second response, oil fields are immobile, which means it's much easier for the coalition to recapture those oil fields or becomes easy target for the coalition. What is the juxtaposition in this debate? Two things. Firstly, slaves can be covertly moved from one place to another, which means that the ability of Western forces to capture, to save them, is reduced quite significantly, which means that our ability to treat them as cash cows increased quite significantly. No. The second and most pertinent response, I think this is also one of my extensions, is that slaves are exceptionally valuable assets. Let's acknowledge the nuance in the bargaining power which ISIS has. Jay told us, in closing government, that we need to put a face on these slaves. The problem now is that now ISIS has massive bargaining power to gain so much from Western and Middle Eastern forces in order for them to sell off these slaves. Why must the coalition abide to all the demands of ISIS? Two reasons. One, once you open up the floodgates by accepting the transaction of slaves, that means you create a precedent for the public in your country that this is something which is legitimate. That means future family members who are called will say, hey, if you could pay for that person, you must also pay for my family to be released as well. And society and the voters will demand based on that precedent to begin with. But secondly, the point in which you value these slaves, ladies and gentlemen, ISIS then realized that since this is a valuable asset, I can make sure that I use this asset to its fullest advantage. That means that I'll publicize the torture and suffering of this individual online, on television, ladies and gentlemen, until all my demands are met. What is the example which we pointed to? Notice when South Korea and Japan opened up the floodgates to pay ransoms to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, initially they only paid $50 million US. What happened after is that because the demands kept on increasing, South Korea and Japan were forced to pull out from Afghanistan and Iraq, ladies and gentlemen. That's why the presence of the forces are no longer there. It starts off with you only losing money, but the precursor to that now they'll push for more prisoners of ISIS to be released. It means that now you can no longer launch airstrikes. It means all those ridiculous stuff will further be asserted, and you cannot bow down from that demands because of the publicization of that precedent to begin with. It's not about money. It means that you lose your ability to combat ISIS completely. Losing South Korea and Japan have been disastrous. Imagine losing the United States. No. Second clash in this debate facilitates ideological stronghold. Let's acknowledge one thing. Both sides agree that not everyone is automatically supportive of ISIS. Often, a person's ideology is constructed. In their world, once you fund ISIS a lot more, it means now ISIS can run more cities and madrasas to perpetuate their ideological stronghold through education, through more people preaching this over and over again. It also means this money can be used to generate welfare, which magnetizes a lot of people in between. People in Iraq prioritizes welfare a lot more than weapons, in which side opening opposition talked about. And we think this is something which is particularly pertinent. This means now ISIS becomes a conduit for Sunni representation, because now they can form an alternative state, ladies and gentlemen, an alternative state which is based on dependence and reliance on welfare and also based on patronage. The fight against ISIS is not a fight against weapons. We have so much more weapons than them. But the fight is a fight against the numbers and the ideological stronghold which is constructed by finance, like what La Familia did in the Hidalgo region in Mexico. Opening.
Sir, we can very easily draw a line at only transacting for slaves without transacting for hostages. We still save thousands of more slaves than you.
Okay, it's not that easy. Japan and South Korea thought the same thing, $50 million US. But once you open the floodgates, the family members of future slaves will demand for it. The public will demand for it. International media will demand for it. You are not in control of the immense pressure which might come in the future. Deal with that scenario. Final extension of this debate. Their policy allows ISIS to employ non-ISIS networks to kidnap for money. Let's acknowledge one thing, ladies and gentlemen. Let's look at the context of Sunnis and Kurdish living in the Waziristan area. Under status quo, ladies and gentlemen, the Sunnis could still live side by side with the Kurds. But the point in which Now the Kurds realize that any member of the Sunni can kidnap me and then become the intermediary, which will then gain money from ISIS, because now ISIS will be rewarded for that money, means that any Sunni which lives in that area could be mobilized as an ISIS fighter because of the welfare and the money which that person will get. This means, ladies and gentlemen, that this will breed sectarian violence, which the Kurds and Sunnis are already distrusting of one another, but not anybody which is a Sunni, anyone now can kidnap me and sell me off and will be rewarded. That means ISIS strength is not only contingent on their active members, but also on their passive members who might sell them off. Why is this the most important extension of this debate? One, because it means that this debate not only moves upon ISIS strongholds, that means every area in Iraq, Afghanistan and Syria could be impacted. It also means it fragments our fight against ISIS, that now we're fighting each other before we can combat ISIS. For these three reasons, I'm very happy to oppose.
Thank you very much, Sadiq. And now to begin the final exchange in this debate, we'd like to invite from Closing Government, Moayad.
Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, a little over a year ago, I thought my debating career was as good as over. But here I am debating against Malaysia's best in front of a room of the brightest minds in Malaysia, Asia, and arguably the world as well. And I give thanks to every single one of you for reminding me why I love this sport so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to stand on a team that supports a concerted fight against ISIS. I am proud to stand on a team that supports the liberalization of women held at the behest of ISIS. But more than that, I am proud to be on the same team as YB Khairi Jamluddin, where we can both go back home and tweet, "Glory, glory, Man United." Ladies and gentlemen, I'll talk this debate with regards to two issues. First, I'll talk about the slaves and their importance to ISIS. And secondly, I'll talk about the war that we are dealing with right now. Firstly, let's talk about these slaves, and we'll deal with Sadiq's extensions in my speech, right? Firstly, Sadiq says that, look, slaves are now valuable assets, and therefore they have major bargaining power when you trade with Western nations. We think this is contradictory to the characterizations that both he and side opening opposition earlier on provided. Because the characterizations, if you really notice, was that A, ISIS is currently losing money, and B, that they are unable to sell oil or be able to get more funds into them. With this regard, we think that the more likely option of happening is that they will regard women, which is naturally they can find in every single village, as something that is more disposable than you think they are. Therefore, they would rather sell them for cheap profit, knowing that there was no other place they can get money from, knowing that their oil is largely unprofitable, knowing that they are losing bases and losing men that are contributing to the financial stability of ISIS. So with this, we think that the context in which they did set this debate cannot fly with the argument that Sadiq brought, that immediately the bargaining chip will be immediately stronger on their point. But let's say, even if it is a bargaining chip on the part of ISIS, and they do manage to charge an exorbitant amount for these individuals, we think we have to look at the long-term trade-offs. Because if you really realize the speech that Jay gave, the considerations of individuals in joining ISIS does not center around money and solely money. In fact, we would contend and we would argue that women or the women slaves are indeed the major part or a major part of the considerations of which you join ISIS. Because immediately if you tie it to ideological sentiments and the fact that me buying this woman or me getting a woman slave and being able to liberate her from the shackles of Christianity and immediately providing me a gateway into heaven, that is a more major incentive than any amount of money can give these individuals, Mr. Speaker. So we think with this regard, we think with this regard, we have to look at a trade-off. The moment you buy these slaves off and they are inaccessible to the recruits that you want to recruit, that is a better trade-off than whatever money can give these individuals, because money isn't the end-all be-all for the recruitment efforts of ISIS, Mr. Speaker. That was the nuance in Jay's speech that Sadiq wasn't able to deal with. Secondly, let's deal with this idea of an ideological stronghold that Sadiq wanted to talk about, right? Because he says that what will happen right now is that you will give more welfare and give more money to build madrasas around the region. But you have to realize this. In the context of which ISIS is already losing as provided by their side, this is a battle in which we don't think, the ideological battle is not a battle they can win just by using money manager. In a context where people are already fatigued from joining ISIS, that they see that the ISIS effort is slowly being destroyed and not reaching its goals, Mr. Speaker, we think that this is a battle that no one wants to join. Therefore, if you look at the global consensus, is that ISIS is a global evil and should be combated at any point, no matter who you are. With this rhetoric, coupled with the fact that they are losing, this doesn't mean that just giving money or giving welfare or teaching them in schools will immediately change their calculus to join ISIS. But the more important thing is the use of a women in making sure that they get some spiritual fulfillment at the end. That is the stronger rhetoric that they are more likely latch onto in order to join ISIS, because they think that if they die at the hands of the West in their fight against ISIS, they will still go to heaven at the end of the day because they managed to convert a girl or they managed to protect her from the horrors of war. So we think with regards to ideological strongholds, we think that you don't win, you're unable to win that battle on your side, but on our side, at least you remove a ideological ammo for them in the form of a woman and in the form of being able to quote unquote liberate her from the shackles of the world and from the shackles of war. We think that that's the important considerations for a lot of recruitment. But why is money not the major consideration for these individuals? Because if you really think about Jasmine's POI that she asked Jay and why they would take this money, we think that essentially it's because of the context in which you set in, that they are losing the fight and they need more capital, right? That's why they'll act in a myopic way and immediately take whatever change that you give them, right? But the major consideration for other recruitees does not center around money. Why? Because this can be mitigated. In the same way how money is a finite resource and they don't know where they can spend your money, similar to how you can't sell your oils around the world, we think that this is a major disincentive for other individuals to just take money and not have some form of other ideological backup to why they're joining ISIS. We think that the reason they join ISIS is to get that spiritual fulfillment that comes in the form of slaves, and we stop that on the side of closing government. I'll take closing.
Are you seriously suggesting that the vast majority of ISIS supporters prioritize sex and slaves a lot more than welfare, healthcare, education for your children, and all the other things which exist in our life?
Look, you see, the thing about healthcare and welfare and whatever can be provided by any other actor that you subscribe to, right? The problem with women and the rhetoric that ISIS use is that you are able to fulfill a spiritual fulfillment and an ideological one the moment you provide her with a great life away from the horrors of war, quote unquote again. But that's the thing, right? These women act as a conduit to heaven, and these people so blindly take it, and we should stop that on our side. Lastly, let's talk about the war. The point of which they didn't engage with Jay was with regards to the humanization of these individuals, right? We think at the moment, the media paints the war against ISIS as things, you only see guns, you only see soldiers, you only see explosions. But no one necessarily sees the innocent civilians that are hung on the ground that are now conflated with being affiliated with ISIS. We think right now, the moment you show these individuals, you are more empathetic to those who are innocent that are surviving on the ground. More than that, you're able to relate that pain to other individuals you feel that might suffer the same fate if you don't stop this war. That gives you relatability. That gives you an impetus to start mobilizing and going up against ISIS. I have never been prouder to propose.
Thank you very much, Mayad. And now to conclude the debate, we'd like to invite from IIUM Mubarak.
ISIS operates in some cities. The problem with them is that they create a situation where sectarian violence spreads, not just to the few cities that ISIS controls, but to each and every other areas, where often Sunni minorities live with Kurdish communities or Shia communities. We think this is a situation that leads to a complete, humongous, vast increase in conflict zones, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that was therefore the most important exception that we brought. They never responded. Three things I want to talk about. First, how do they empower ISIS militarily? Second, ideologically. And third, why is it that they lead to complete, total violence and any removal of control that we have over those territories? First, in terms of how it empowers them militarily, right? We must first understand, and this is what we said, they're like, oh, we need to create a human face and whatnot. We told you the point at which you create sympathy creates a situation where ISIS is able to use that to be able to ask for more and more money. We don't think that's a contradiction in characterization that they're weak. Even if they're weak, they could still show videos of people being tortured. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that remember when we did this, and we tried to release 2 soldiers, American soldiers, we paid $5 million each for each soldier. The point at which this becomes a policy and an expectation that each and every slave must be saved, that point at which, ladies and gentlemen, ISIS can demand more and more and more money. It's not just about the money that opening opposition talks about, but the sheer volumes of it that will be given to ISIS that creates the amount of power, ladies and gentlemen, that will be given to them under their model. That means if really thousands of them exist under Hassan's model, just imagine you're making ISIS billionaires overnight with just the soldiers, with just the hostages they have today. We think that is the comparative. Even if oil fields give them money, now you give more ability for them to be able to defend those oil fields. You now create a situation where they're able to establish more and more channels. And Qatari sheikhs that you talk about feel even more confident that they're supporting a winning side that is sustainable as well. We would argue they're the ones who do all of those kinds of things. What that necessarily means, ladies and gentlemen, is the amount of military might that they're creating is unfathomable compared to what they have today. They might have some $1 million, but each and every soldier, each and every hostages that they have will now keep on doubling and doubling and doubling their money. The amount of might they have is uncomparable to what any organization, terrorist organization, has ever had in history. Let's talk about the second issue. What happens ideologically as a result of this? ISIS starts out as a very different organization from Al-Qaeda or the Taliban because they want to create a system, because they want to create a state. What does this mean? They give a different conception of a life to people living in poverty for long periods of time. We're talking about Sunni minorities within Middle Eastern countries such as Iraq, for example, right? And it's Hyder al-Abadi, not Abidi. Let's talk about that. So first, in terms of what's happening there, we would understand, they're going to say, oh, but anyone can pay them. No, they can't. It's a conflict zone, right? People don't have access to money. For decades and decades, if not centuries, people have lived in absolute poverty. If there's one thing they care about more than the warring factions, it's the idea that their children can get an education, can get access to health, that their parents who are old can get access to healthcare. That is what now ISIS is able to provide to those individuals on the ground to be able to get their support. That's what they necessarily lose out. The reliance on welfare and systems of patronage means people have a selfish interest not to cooperate with you in terms of your fight against ISIS to begin with. We think you completely annihilate our ability to win the ideological war against ISIS. What did Moyed say? Moyed said, oh, but we take away their ability to use slaves because that's like the biggest incentive for people to join. Guys, just because we pay them to feed their slaves doesn't mean they're not going to use their slaves and rape them first before giving it to you. In fact, they're going to be tortured even more and more and more in order to fully exploit the ability of you to pay to them. So like closing government extension goes away. Third issue in this debate, and we think this is an absolute shame that they never really came back to it. What did we tell you? We told you the amount of might that they give you. Yes, obviously, they want to take more and more slaves under both models. However, the benefit on the side government's model is they want to take more wives and stuff like that. They can have more sex, those kind of stuff. However, the comparative is that they don't economically do that because it doesn't make economic sense for them to do so. The point at which you give them a monetary incentive, because even if slave trade happens locally, it's nowhere near as lucrative as the international market that we now create, right? So on that comparative, what happens? If they have that money, they can now make major investments. They can ask, for example, a Sunni poor person living in a Kurdish community to sabotage their neighbor and give that person, because you can get humongous thousands and thousands of dollars as a result of that. That is a strategy that they can now employ. And those people who live in absolute poverty, that is an extremely lucrative offer if you've lived in absolute poverty for the entire life. What does this mean? Even if those people don't say yes, that is a situation that creates humongous amounts of paranoia. So now, Kurdish Peshmerga might be able to go ahead and defend a lot of Kurds by making sure ISIS does not take over their territory. However, under their model, that is now no longer enough, because minorities from within their own region might sabotage you, might go ahead and kidnap you and take you out of their territory and give you over to ISIS to begin with. I'll explain that further, but before that, go ahead, Opening.
Your slippery slope arguments don't clash with the media narrative of freed slaves. That is the only thing that has counteracted recruitment in ISIS.
Freed slaves don't counteract recruitment in ISIS. In fact, ISIS glorifies the violence they do. That's why they put beheading pictures out there. I think ISIS is like, this is free media, like propaganda for them, guys. Like, sit down. No, thank you. In terms of what happens in terms of sectarian violence, in fact, the fact that they're able to make it seem that they're so strong by going ahead and torturing so many people is what appeals to a lot of people. Like, I don't know why, but it does, right? Moving on. In terms of what happens in terms of sectarian violence, so what did we tell you? Creates a situation of paranoia, for example, within Kurdish communities. What does this eventually lead to? This often leads to a lot of unnecessary violence against anyone who might be Sunni, because that person is seen as a possible ISIS supporter now, because now that person has an incentive to support ISIS. Before this, they also didn't want ISIS to take over because obviously there's a lot of violence attached to it. But now there's a lot of monetary incentives for them to do so. That means a lot of lynchings might happen against Sunni populations in outer territories who are not inside ISIS. But the worst case is this. Often Kurdish communities will completely exile any and all Sunni minorities that often live within their territory and kick them out of their territory in order to make sure they survive in the long run. This is likely to create not thousands, but millions of refugees and homeless people, ladies and gentlemen, with an already conflict zone. This is likely to expand the conflict that exists within those countries into more and more cities. There is not going to be any place left for people to go to. For all those reasons, there is absolutely no reason for you to go ahead and funnel the machine that is ISIS. I humbly propose.
Thank you very much for that entertaining debate. Now the judges will adjourn for deliberation.
Có live stream mà nó sẽ đi kịp